our government has again been urged to fast-track measures aimed at avoiding the greylisting by the Paris-based Financial Action Task Team, which has given us until next month to address the weaknesses found in combating the risk of money laundering and the financing of terrorism. A special report by Intellidex, commissioned by Business Leadership South Africa, has found that the country is unlikely to meet that deadline. It's recommended that the state moves at a faster pace. But Parliament has now refused to give the green light to draft legislation in this regard, saying more than just a month is needed for public comments. We join now with Busisiwe Mavuso, the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Busisiwe, good afternoon to you. I really appreciate the time on the pulse. Is there any prospect at this stage of avoiding the grey-listing? Is it possible for us to do that?
You know, Stephen, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. So this is very much a subjective matter, and I think the reason why we're putting the probability at what we're putting it is precisely because there is still room for improvement. It was very encouraging, actually, for us listening to National Treasury yesterday, you know, talking about the interventions that they've actually put in place to ensure that we avoid being grey-listed. We also had a conversation with Shamila Patel, who was actually putting in place similar interventions. You know, she's talking about the 9 seminal cases that they've actually put to the courts, and we know that this is one of the biggest issues that FATF has actually had this conversation with South Africa. You know, some of the priority actions that are actually coming from FATF, they are saying that they have a problem with the fact that we have not done enough, you know, to deal with the state capture projects that we had as a country, and no people have actually been prosecuted. So we are hoping that, you know, it's not too little too late. We are hoping that by the time we actually have the conversation with them in January on face-to-face conversations, by the time they receive and review the reports in December and whatever updates that we would have given them, maybe, you know, that those interventions will be enough to salvage the situation and ensure that South Africa doesn't go into a grey list. Even if maybe we don't get totally taken off the list or we are not cleared, Stephen, I'm hoping that they can at least say, with all these interventions, let's see you again in a year or something like that, you know, so that we just ensure that we avert this. But yeah, it's all hands on deck, and I think National Treasury really needs to be commended for the great work that they've done so far.
If we are grey-listed, what impact would it have on us? I mean, it's about financial flows. Financial flows really matter to our economy.
It is. You know, when you have the conversations, I think, with the financial institutions, you know, in particular, you look at it and you'd see that, number one, it's actually going to have, and for the broader country, actually, it's going to have a serious reputational risk, you know, in South Africa, from a financial markets perspective. You know, you will know that we're actually going to have enhanced due diligence that is actually going to have to be imposed on South African companies, which is further going to increase the compliance and the administration that they actually have to put in place. You know, funding could be impacted. You know, the EU and the UK particularly will have to impose a higher risk category on South Africa, you know, and its counterparts, and that might have an impact on our investment flows. This is particularly important, Stephen, because EU and the UK are our biggest trading partners, you know, as a country. So them automatically putting us on a higher risk category because we're grey-listed might mean, you know, that the investment drive that we're on to try and increase our economic growth might actually be jeopardized and might actually be impacted. You know, individuals like you and I, you know, as well, for whatever financial international transactions that we're going to have to do, you know, we are actually going to be treated with more scrutiny. So I think it just becomes difficult. But also, it becomes difficult for those companies that are looking at coming into South Africa, because they look at it and they say, is it really worth it, you know, to go into an environment where doing business, you know, in that country is going to be difficult for me. So it's those issues really, you know, that are actually going to be tough for South Africa. And we're just worried that they might actually be a disincentive for those investors that would have eyed South Africa as an investment destination.
Busisiwe, we've had so much warning about this. I mean, for years we've been told that this could happen. Why have we moved so slowly? Who do you blame for that?
The reason why we're even here, Stephen, is because of the state capture project. You know, FATF has looked at it and they've said that South Africa, you seem to don't have the controls in place to ensure that anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, doesn't happen, in your environment. But they are also looking at it and they are saying that you might be a weak link because whatever money laundering practices seems like, because of the fact that you don't have these controls in place, money laundering can easily, go through South Africa as a country. We don't have interventions, for instance, of cross-border cash that actually comes into the country. A person can bring cash into the country with ease, and they are saying that where are those controls? But they've also looked at how weakened our criminal justice system, has been during the state capture project, and they looked at it, and remember, this was in 2019, and they were saying that we don't see interventions that are actually looking at correcting this, so it's all those issues that they've actually raised. So it has taken us time to obviously get to where we are, and it becomes difficult because this is something for all of government to do. When you look at these priority actions that we actually need to address, it doesn't only sit with one government unit. It sits with the NPA, it sits with the South African Reserve Bank, it sits with National Treasury, it sits all over the place, so the coordinating of this effort has been rather difficult. I also think that we have taken a little bit of time to start addressing, some of these issues. I'm thinking that probably the National Treasury was sitting, resting, and thinking that those institutions that have to address these issues are actually doing their job, probably maybe only to wake up at the 11th hour to see that we haven't been. So it's one of those things where we have really slept on the job because we know what we had to do. I don't know whether was it a function of political will, was it a function of an incapable state, was it a function, of the fact that we continue to use these institutions as ground zero for siphoning funds out of the state, that we are not interested in addressing some of these proposed interventions. It could be a culmination of all of these issues, and we find ourselves where we are at the moment. And I think National Treasury and NPA and a whole lot of institutions are really running around to ensure that this can be averted.
Busisiwe Mavuso, thank you very much indeed, CEO of Business Leadership.